The pounding in my head was relentless, like a jackhammer tearing through my skull, each pulse a sharp reminder of the reckless overindulgence. My mouth tasted of stale alcohol, and the heavy sloshing of too many drinks churned unpleasantly in my gut. Every time I closed my eyes, the room tilted violently, forcing me to dangle one foot off the side of the bed, pressing it against the scratchy, thin carpet to keep from spinning into oblivion. A flash of memory hit me, a blur of lights, confetti raining down, someone handing me yet another shot while the countdown roared through the room. My cousin Dan, grinning like a maniac, dared me to outdrink him. The crowd had cheered as I raised the glass to my lips. I groaned, regretting every second of it now. A low chuckle escaped me, still half caught in the haze of the night. New Year's Eve had always been chaos, but combining it with my birthday, pure madness. I should have known better, but every year I fell into the same trap. It was practically a tradition at this point, ever since I had got my first fake ID, a ritual of excess that I'd come to expect. "How are you feeling?" Dan's voice cut through the fog, startling me. My cousin, 10 years older, always quick with his smug wisdom, stood by the bed, looking way too chipper for someone who'd been there with me all night. I squinted against the sunlight streaming through the now wide-open curtains, silently cursing him for the intrusion. I buried my face in a pillow that reeked of smoke and spilled beer, pulling the duvet over my head in a futile attempt to block him and the rest of the world out. "Not feeling too great, huh?" Dan's voice dripped with amusement as he poked me through the covers. "Come on, kid, time to rise and shine." "Kid?" I croaked, my voice rough as I dragged myself from the cocoon of blankets. "I'm 20 now, not a kid anymore." Dan let out a condescending laugh, the kind that made me want to punch him. "Yeah? I've seen the videos from last night. You're all over YouTube. If you want to convince me you're all grown up, you've got a long road ahead, buddy." My stomach lurched, a stab of panic cutting through the haze. "YouTube?" I groaned, sinking back into the pillow, wishing I could disappear into the bed entirely. Bloody YouTube. I could already imagine the guys lining up to show me the latest viral masterpiece. Me, making a complete idiot of myself, drunkenly falling into tables, maybe doing something even worse. Was I surprised? Not in the slightest. I would have done the same to any of them, and I had more than once. This was the price of admission for our chaotic little group. I smiled despite myself. This was the ritual, the wild night, the hangover, the public shaming that followed. We all took turns in the spotlight, embracing the ridiculousness of it all. Now it was my turn. Groaning, I sat up, the grin still lingering on my lips. "Hell of a night," I mumbled, accepting the pint of water Dan handed me. I took a long sip, savoring the cool relief before adding, "But seriously, never again." Dan ruffled my hair like I was still a kid. "You always say that," he teased. "Your New Year's Eve birthday combo is legendary, you know, the highlight of the year." I shrugged, the weight of his words sinking in. Maybe it was time to stop acting like a kid. I was 20 now. "I need to start growing up," I mumbled. Dan caught my gaze, and for a brief moment, something unspoken passed between us. The weight of those words, growing up, hung in the air. Then, as if on cue, we both burst into laughter, loud and unnecessary, still riding the buzz of last night. "Not for a while yet," Dan said, reclaiming the empty glass. "You've got plenty of time for that. I'd be disappointed if you didn't make a few more dumb decisions before maturity finally catches up with you." He clapped me lightly on the back. "Now, go grab a shower. There's plenty of hot water. I'll get the coffee brewing." I yawned, stretching, but the exhaustion weighed me down. I might just sleep a bit longer. Dan's tone hardened. No nonsense now. "Nope, not happening. Someone's coming over in an hour." "So what?" "He's got work for us," Dan said, already heading for the door. "Something big. Could be the start of something huge for both of us." A knot formed in my stomach. "Work? What kind of work?" Dan didn't answer. He was gone before I could ask anything more, leaving me to wonder what I was about to get myself into. The world exploded, though not all at once. It began with a low hum, a vibration deep inside my skull, like the distant buzz of a wasp trapped in a jar. My senses warped and blurred at the edges, as if reality itself was slipping through my fingers. The room around me began to warp, twisting in ways it shouldn't, my heartbeat echoing like a distant drum. Voices, distorted and muffled, crawled through the air, indistinct, disjointed whispers that I couldn't quite grasp. And then, the flash came. A blinding white surge tore through my mind, obliterating every coherent thought. It felt like ice-cold needles were being driven into my brain, stabbing relentlessly at the core of my being. I opened my mouth to scream, but no sound emerged, just a void where my voice should have been, where my entire body should have been. I felt distant, like my mind was being pulled away, left to float, helpless and disembodied, in a sea of raw, excruciating pain that stretched on for what felt like eternity. When the light finally faded, the darkness that replaced it was suffocating. My eyelids burned, heavy and unwilling to respond. My breath, jagged and harsh, scraped through my throat, a brittle sound like the crunch of dry leaves beneath boots. I tried to move, but my limbs were sluggish, unfamiliar, as if I was trapped inside someone else's body. I pressed myself upright, the pillow beneath me foreign, too dense, too uncomfortable. But the real shock came with the sharp, searing ache in my joints, muscles groaning under a weight that felt wrong. This wasn't the dull throb of a hangover. It was deeper, more primal, as though I had been fighting for hours. "How are you feeling?" The voice was sterile, devoid of warmth, cutting through the haze like a cold wind. It wasn't Dan. I knew that immediately, but my mind grasped for familiarity, for any anchor in the disorienting fog. "Dan?" I said anyway. My voice was barely a whisper, cracked and unfamiliar. I needed it to be him. Needed anything to make sense. "No, I'm Custody Officer Sterling." His tone was robotic, offering no comfort, just cold, detached professionalism. "What's happening? I can't see!" Panic clawed at my chest, each word ragged, my pulse pounding as the disorientation deepened. My eyes still refused to open, leaving me trapped in this dark, unfamiliar void. "Relax." Sterling's monotone grated against my nerves, offering nothing to ease the growing terror. "Your contact screens were deactivated. They'll come back online in a moment." Contact screens. The word echoed in my mind, alien and wrong. What the hell had happened to me? Before I could even begin to make sense of it, a flicker of light invaded the darkness behind my eyelids. Blurry shapes wavered, grays and blacks smeared like wet ink, distorting and shifting. Then, color, swirling, chaotic, like a broken screen trying to right itself. Gradually, it all began to sharpen into something like a TV test screen, crisp bars of color snapping into place with a clarity so vivid it was jarring, almost too real. It was like stepping from a fog into harsh, glaring light. I should have marveled at the clarity. Instead, cold dread settled deep in my gut. The test screen flickered away, and my vision slowly adjusted to the harsh brightness around me. I blinked, eyes stinging, trying to make sense of my surroundings. The smooth, pristine walls glared back at me, sterile and unnervingly clean, with a harsh, white glow. Everything felt wrong, like a nightmare masquerading as reality. A bed shelf jutted out from the wall, barely more than a slab with a threadbare mattress. There was a metal sink, a toilet bolted to the ground, and a small, grated window set high up, none of it familiar, none of it comforting. I shifted, and a jolt of pain shot through my muscles, stiff and unresponsive, as though they'd been unused for ages. The panic built, each beat of my heart thundering louder in my ears. The barred window, the solid metal door, there was no mistaking it. This was a cell. My pulse quickened, mind racing to grasp the impossible truth of it. But the more I tried to remember, the more my thoughts seemed to slip away, dissolving like sand through my fingers. I shifted again, forcing my sluggish body upright, only to remember I wasn't alone. A man stood near the door, watching me with an intensity that made my skin prickle. He was young, maybe mid-20s, with closely cropped brown hair and sharp hawk-like features. His gaze was cold and unflinching, a dispassionate observer cataloging every twitch, every strained breath. He wore a crisp, gray suit that looked almost as out of place as I felt, the stark lines of it cutting against the sterile backdrop of the cell. The only color came from the polished sheen of his shoes, reflecting the harsh light like a mirror. "Better?" he asked, the word clipped, devoid of any real concern. It was the voice of someone who had asked the same question too many times, expecting the same empty response. I swallowed, my throat parched and raw. "What's happening?" I rasped, struggling to force out the words. My voice sounded alien, like it was coming from somewhere outside my own body. How did I get here?" The man sighed, the sound heavy with the kind of weary impatience that made me feel stupid, like a child asking a question they should already know the answer to. You've been subjected to an SMD. The acronym meant nothing. I shook my head, a faint, confused gesture. What does that even mean? His expression tightened, lips thinning. He leaned slightly forward, as if the movement would make the explanation sink in. An SMD, a sentence of memory dismissal. The words hung in the air, incomprehensible, twisting in my mind like something dangerous and sharp. I stared at him, heart pounding, waiting for the punchline, for any sign that this was some kind of sick joke. But his gaze remained flat, unyielding. A chill slid down my spine. I faltered, shaking my head again, trying to clear the fog. I don't understand. Of course you don't, he murmured, almost to himself, before turning and cracking the door open just wide enough to speak through. His words were a low, urgent mutter to someone unseen outside, but I caught the tail end of it. He was reset to before 2055. How was he even supposed to process this? There was a response, something muffled and indistinct, but I couldn't make it out. The man sighed, closing the door and locking it with a solid final click. He faced me again, his face a mask of professional detachment. "Sit down," he ordered, his tone softening just a fraction, as if he realized the severity of what he was about to say. I hadn't even noticed I was standing, every muscle in my body trembling with fatigue. Slowly, painfully, I lowered myself onto the hard bed, my legs barely supporting me. Everything ached, my joints, my spine, even my chest burned with a dull, relentless throb. How long had I been out? What had happened to me? He stepped closer, just out of arm's reach, arms crossed tightly over his chest. His gaze flickered, something almost like sympathy ghosting across his face before disappearing. "It seems you've been restored to a time before the SMD laws were enacted," he explained, voice pitched low, almost soothing. "That's why none of this is making sense to you." Restored? The word twisted on my tongue, wrong and unfamiliar. Restored from what? I'm not some broken thing you can just fix. My voice broke, weak and desperate. The man's jaw clenched, the faintest crease forming between his brows. "You committed a serious offense," he said slowly, each word weighted with meaning. "No," I whispered, shaking my head, a sharp, frantic movement. "No, I didn't." "Yes, you did." The quiet insistence in his voice stilled me. He held my gaze, unwavering, as if willing me to believe him. "Let me finish." "I would never," I muttered, but the hollowness of my words unsettled me. My mind scrambled for fragments, for anything to prove my innocence or confirm my guilt. But there was nothing. The dread rose, clawing at my throat, but I swallowed it down, teeth gritted as I forced myself to remain silent, waiting for whatever came next. He drew a deep breath, his tone slipping back into cool professionalism. "You were found guilty of a crime." He paused, a flash of something unreadable in his eyes. "The details aren't something I'm authorized to discuss. You can look it up later if you still care to know." "I didn't do anything," I choked out, the words almost lost in the rising tide of panic. "I didn't. Will you let me explain?" His voice sharpened, and he lifted a hand in a clear command to stop. The raw authority in it stunned me into silence. He waited until I nodded, breath hitching painfully, before continuing. "Your memories were erased, piece by piece, until we reached the moment where your life diverged. The moment that set you on a path to becoming a danger." He hesitated, eyes flicking away for just a second. "An SMD means everything after that point is gone. Your life, your identity, your crimes, erased as if they never happened." I stared at him, uncomprehending. "Everything? My life, everything I was, wiped away, just gone?" "In essence," he finished quietly, "you were restored to a version of yourself from before it all went wrong." The words were like a blade cutting through me. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think. I tried to push back against it, to insist to myself that I couldn't have done something so terrible, but a hollow feeling in my chest wouldn't let the thought stick. Was there a part of me, something buried in the years I'd lost, that was capable of it? I grasped at any memory that might counter the idea, prove I wasn't the monster they believed me to be, but everything slipped away like sand through my fingers, leaving me drowning in guilt I couldn't justify or deny. What kind of person had I become that it had to be erased completely? And what kind of life was left for me now? How long had I lost? I was 20, wasn't I? The room seemed to spin, the pain in my chest tightening. My life was a blank slate, but I wasn't the one who had wiped it clean. Dan, his face flushed with excitement, had been standing in the doorway that morning, his words heavy with promise. "This is it, man. This could be huge." He was grinning in that way that meant trouble, the kind of grin I'd always followed, no matter how much it hurt later. There was a flash of unease under the excitement, a feeling I'd pushed down countless times before. Dan always had that effect, pulling me in with his infectious energy while leaving a trail of questions in his wake. That look of his meant success, or something close enough, but it also meant risk, things going wrong, and I'd been willing to ignore it. I remembered the knot of anticipation in my stomach, the way my heart had quickened. But after that, nothing. The thread of memory unraveled, slipping away into the void. "Arterial alert!" The text flashed in front of my eyes, sharp and cold. "Caution." I gasped, my chest tightening as panic seized me. My heart pounded erratically, a violent drumbeat that rattled my ribs. My vision blurred, the sterile walls of the cell fading in and out of focus. Sweat slicked my palms as I clutched the bed, desperate for something solid to anchor myself. Every breath felt like it might be my last. "What's happening to me?" My voice was small, trembling, barely more than a rasp. My mind raced, grasping at memories that slipped through my fingers like water. Who had I been? What had I done? Sterling's expression faltered, just for a second, a crack in the mask. "Stay calm," he said, though I could hear the tightness in his voice now, a hint of unease. "The autodocs will handle it." More text appeared in my vision. "Autodoc cluster 18DT dispatched from chest cavity dispensary." A soft, mechanical whir vibrated through my body, and then relief. A cooling sensation spread through my chest, like ice water being poured over the fire that had raged moments before. The tightness eased, the pain retreating to a dull throb, but a deeper unease settled within me, prickling at the edges of my awareness. This wasn't natural, wasn't me. The cool, automatic response to my pain felt invasive, foreign, and as much as it was helping, I couldn't shake the feeling that something vital had been taken away in the process. How many times had this thing repaired me, and at what cost? Each wave of relief only sharpened my discomfort, as though I'd become some project patched together to keep running. My hands trembled as I pressed them to my chest, feeling the steady, unfamiliar rhythm beneath my skin. There was a strange detachment now, like I was no longer in control of my own body, just a passenger while machines did the real work. "Better now?" Sterling's voice cut through the fog, watching me with clinical precision, like I was just another data point. I nodded weakly, still in shock. "Yeah, I think so." He straightened, his professional demeanor sliding back into place. "You'll be released in a few hours. Try to rest." His tone was flat, dismissive, as though the crisis had passed, and now I was just another task on his list. "Wait," I croaked, my voice shaky but desperate. "When do I get my memories back?" Sterling paused at the door, glancing over his shoulder with a look of mild amusement, like I'd asked something ridiculous. "You don't," he said, his voice flat and final. "It wouldn't be much of a fix or punishment if you did." The words hit me like a punch to the gut. My stomach dropped, a hollow pit opening up inside me. "This is permanent?" I whispered, but the door was already closing behind him, leaving me alone in the sterile, suffocating silence. I stared at the cold, empty room around me, the enormity of what had just been said sinking in like a slow-acting poison. Permanent. My memories, my identity, gone, erased as if they had never existed. Everything I had ever been, everything I could have been, wiped away. A life I could never remember, stolen from me. What was left of me now? My hands trembled as I touched my face, trying to remember the person I used to be, but there was nothing, just a void. I wasn't even sure if the memories I had left, the flashes of Dan, the moments of my past, were real, or if they were just fragments my mind had invented to fill the emptiness. What had I lost? And worse, what had I done to deserve this? I felt the weight of it pressing down on me, suffocating. Who am I now? And again, the question became lodged in my thoughts. How long had I lost? For what felt like an eternity, I sat frozen on the edge of the bed, trying to process the impossible reality thrust upon me. My mind clung desperately to the last clear thought I could grasp. I was 20, right? That was the last thing I knew. I had plans, dreams, things I was going to do while I was still young. How much of that was now gone? How long did I have left of my 20s, of my youth? Eventually, the oppressive weight of sitting still became too much to bear. I had to move, to do something, anything to anchor myself. My legs trembled as I pushed myself up, every muscle stiff and uncooperative, as though I was shaking off years of disuse. There was a toilet and sink at the far end of the room, and the simple act of relieving myself seemed like a step towards normalcy, however illusory that normalcy felt. But as I stumbled past the sink, a flicker of movement in the mirror stopped me dead in my tracks. I froze. The face staring back at me wasn't mine, or at least, it wasn't the face I remembered. My breath hitched, a brittle gasp escaping my lips as my knees buckled. I collapsed onto the cold, hard floor, the impact sending a jolt of pain through my limbs, but the shock of what I'd seen numbed everything else. With shaking hands, I grabbed the edge of the sink and pulled myself back up, forcing my eyes to meet the reflection once more. The skin was deeply creased, weathered with age, lines carved into a face that had once been smooth and full of life. My hair, now thin and gray, clung limply to my scalp, lifeless. Dark, hollow eyes stared back at me, sunken into a face that seemed to belong to a man who had lived 100 years. My heart pounded, and I found myself smiling instinctively, expecting my own familiar face to smile back. But that smile twisted on a stranger's lips, a thin, weary mouth mirroring nothing I recognized. I touched my face, the sensation both numb and too sensitive, as if my own skin had turned to stone. In the back of my mind, a small, desperate thought took shape. I'd pull myself up, straighten my stance, do something to prove this wasn't real, that I was still the person I remembered. But my legs wobbled under the effort, the muscles seizing, betraying me. Even the shallow hunch of my shoulders felt foreign, a weight pressing down on my spine. I tried to ball my hands into fists, but my fingers stiffened, refusing to obey, and a wave of frustration and anger tore through me. No, this isn't right, this can't be real. I lifted a trembling hand to touch the reflection, my fingers tracing the unfamiliar contours of my own face. Was this a nightmare? Was I hallucinating? My heart pounded furiously in my chest, each beat a drum of terror. This can't be me. It can't. I felt the panic rising like a tidal wave, my chest tightening until I could barely breathe. My vision blurred, the sterile room swirling around me as my mind spiraled out of control. I clutched at my chest, gasping for air, but the panic only intensified. A low, mechanical hum broke through the haze of terror, and I felt the cool, unnatural sensation of the autodocs kicking in again. Nanomachines, dispatched from somewhere deep within my body, began working to stabilize me. The icy touch spread through my chest, calming the tightness, slowing the frantic pace of my heart. Gradually, the pain dulled and my breathing steadied, but the reflection remained unchanged, an old man where a 20-year-old should have stood. My thoughts were a chaotic jumble. How can this be real? The horror of it all, the dissonance between my mind and body, gnawed at me. Inside, I was still barely more than a teenager, clinging to the memories of youth and possibility. But here, in this strange reality, I had aged decades. The boy I had been was lost somewhere between the cracks of time and memory. The machines repaired me enough to function, to move again, but the foreignness of my own body weighed me down. Each step felt wrong, like I was wearing a suit that didn't fit, dragging a stranger's skin through a nightmare that refused to end. When they finally declared me fit to leave, the words meant nothing. Physically fit, perhaps, but mentally, emotionally, I was shattered, stumbling forward into a world I no longer recognized. Every movement reminded me of the body I no longer knew, the life I had lost. As I walked out of that room, a hollow shell of who I once was, the nightmare showed no signs of release. As I stepped into the harsh daylight, the roar of the crowd hit me like a wall, vibrating through my bones, more real than the ground beneath my feet. The police line strained to hold them back, a heaving, boiling sea of anger and disgust. I knew nothing of the crime for which I had been sentenced, but they certainly remembered. Faces contorted in fury glared at me, eyes wide with loathing. Mud, spit, and curses flew in my direction, smearing my clothes and my skin, each insult punctuated by the slap of something wet and cold against me. Snatches of their words pierced through the chaotic roar, searing into my mind. A woman screamed at me, her voice breaking with fury. "You think you can walk free after what you did?" Another man hurled accusations I couldn't even understand, his face twisted with disgust. "You took everything from us," he shouted, his words crashing over me like a wave. Each phrase hit with the force of a blow, fragments of lives shattered by actions I couldn't remember but felt I should be haunted by. I staggered, leaning heavily on a cane I'd been given, my legs shaking as though they might buckle. How long exactly had I lost? The buildings towered over me, looming metal structures taller and grayer than I remembered, and every street corner buzzed with new, foreign noises. The world I once knew, what I could recall of it, felt like a distant memory in this hostile place. Decades had slipped by, and I'd missed them all. To everyone here, I was not just a stranger. I was a monster in their midst, released mere months after standing trial. Placards filled the air like battle flags, messages etched in bold, angry letters. Monster. Life means life, no justice. Their words blended with the screams, drowning in a violent cacophony that painted me as something less than human. I was the embodiment of failure in their eyes, a criminal they thought was getting a second chance, while they burned with the belief I deserved none. I felt their hate bearing down on me. Like a storm, I had no hope of escaping. But they were wrong. There was no freedom here, no mercy in the release I'd been granted. My prison had just changed walls, moving from steel and concrete to flesh and bone, but it remained inescapable. Inside, I still clung to the last memory I had of being 20. That flicker of hope and purpose, the vision of a life stretching out before me, lay buried under the weight of a body I didn't recognize. I was an old man now, with a body marked by years I couldn't remember, as if someone else had inhabited my flesh all this time. The boy I had been, the dreams he'd carried, the future he'd imagined, had been erased, leaving behind only a stranger's face in the mirror. The cab door slid open with a hum, almost sentient in its motion, startling me. The driver, a cold, polished screen on a chrome rod, glanced back, scanning me with disinterest. No driver, no greeting, just the sterile indifference of automated servitude. The crowd's cries faded into a low hum as I climbed in, their words still twisting through my mind. They wanted justice in iron bars and steel cells, an unbroken punishment. And yet I realized bitterly, the punishment they wished for was already mine. This system, touted as humane, had sentenced me to a life in a body and mind forever fractured by memories taken and time lost. There was no fresh start, no redemption, just a cruel mockery of freedom that continued the punishment in every step, every look from strangers, every dull ache in a body that had lived far longer than I could recall. This was the punishment: to sentence a young man, blameless in his own memory, to live a life he had never earned.